So, sorry, one more bit of esoterica here. Actually, not super esoteric. Like I said, most people don't actually use the prototype way of doing classes. They usually roll their own. So if you look at things like AngularJS, Backbone, Spine, any of the popular libraries, or underscore, or any of that stuff, prototype.js, you'll see that they don't use the regular class and subclass technique. They actually have rolled their own system. So I want to show you how people roll their own system for creating classes or creating what are called modules, which is sort of like a big self-contained block of code. Because you're going to run into this everywhere. And again, you need to be able to, at a minimum, recognize it. And actually, you'll have to write it, but it's not bad. So remember the wizard and person example. Turns out, maybe for a person, instead of a full class, maybe all I really need, let me go grab my editor again, my big blackboard here. Oh, hush. Oh, you started up on me. Cancel. Maybe all I really need is an object. I don't need a full person. So Bilbo, name Bilbo Baggins, location the Shire. Again, remember, this is inside of an object. Those are not semicolons, those are commas. And introduce is a function, console.log im, and this name. Look kind of familiar? Not too bad? OK, so now let's say that we want to add the wizard capability. Well, actually, first off, we could even make a thing that makes new people. I could write something called make person, which is just like creating a person object, except a lot simpler. And it returns a new object. That's what those inner braces are. Name, by the way, if you're creating a new object like this, kind of dynamically, the trick to know is put the values in parentheses. Because otherwise, JavaScript is going to read that second name as a keyword and try to probably not do what you want. Try it out sometime. You'll find out. Trial and error. Great way to learn. Name, location, and introduce. Great. So I can now make a person and pass all this stuff in. I could even, if I wanted to get fancy, seal the object so now it's read-only. I could seal it, so I could make it unmodifiable. Sealing it, sorry, basically means you can't modify it. So I could do that. That's an ES5 feature. Or I could do this. I could replace, if I've got an ES5 browser, I could actually, if I wanted to make it so that the object is still I could still add stuff to the object but not change the name and location, I could use a getter there instead of returning the data. And the getter is a read-only property. And it also makes it nice because then you can just say, you know, person.name, person.location, but it's read-only. Great. Except, you know, handful of clever tricks. Now, let's say that I wanted to make a wizard. So what I could do, wizards have some extra capabilities. I could say make wizard. So I'll start by making a person. Just like before, I did a call to the person constructor. I'll make a person, get back an object. And then I'll say me.orientation equals and add a getter. Because remember, I could take an object and using dot, I can patch new properties, new setters, you know, new functions. I can patch new stuff onto it. So I patch a new orientation getter onto it, and I patch a function called isGood onto it and return it. So I've just taken that first object and extended it. Just like you would do in object-oriented programming, except in object-oriented, when you define a class, that class is kind of the thing that holds on to all of the functions and all of the, everything. In this case, you're actually creating those functions over and over again on each individual object. But a lot of programmers have gotten to like this style better. I know, it's kind of puzzling too, but what you going to do? Folks who came up through more dynamic languages like this style better. Folks who came up through more statically typed languages like Java tend to use the regular constructor system. Now, here's an interesting hack. Let's say, remember my counter before, where I had my counter say something like this? Oh, come on, did I just quit? I just quit. Oh, nuts. Right? That's what I did before. The problem is that that value is actually public. Anybody who has access to counter could see the value, change it, do stuff to it. Maybe that's not what you want. So there's a trick for getting private values. This is why I did the closure thing with you earlier. I create a function called makeCounter. I return a function. I return a function that I call immediately. That inner function has its own variable, and it returns the new object that modifies that variable. So what happens is what I call makeCounter, what I get back is an object with two methods on it, count and reset, and a count underscore count property that I can't see from the outside. This approach has a name. It's called the module pattern. A fellow named Douglas Crockford, who's very big in the JavaScript community, and he's basically the JavaScript architect for Yahoo, coined that term. Extremely common technique. In fact, the other common thing here is declaring a function and then immediately executing it because you want the function to do some work for you also has a name. So I'd sing this to YMCA, but I'll spare you. Yes, IIFE, immediately invoked function expression, where you start a parent function, get to the end, close it, and then execute it. So you create the function, then one shot run it. Super common. Almost every program that you see written these days, if you look at any kind of what they call module loaders in JavaScript, the modules always begin with parent function, empty brace, do a bunch of stuff and execute it at the end. So IIFEs are just everywhere. So now the funny thing is that counter that I created before, now I can do something really interesting with it. Because, okay, so here's my make counter. So I can call it and then I could call counter.count. Too late in the day. Right, I could do all that. Okay, typo. No, not typo. Now, if I wanted to, and this is what a lot of people start doing, is they now add, they take an existing object like this and extend it. Because remember, I can take an object and do dot something equals and patch onto the object. So people will define functions like add, they might call this like extend or add call counter to a counter object. And again, IIFE, because I want to keep this variable truly private. And I say counter.totalCalls equals a new function that wraps itself around that var. So I've now added another method with its own private data to my counter. And so I can say something like counter equals make counter, counter equals add call counter. I don't even actually need the return on this because it's going to modify the object. And then I could actually call counter.totalCalls, and that would be an extra method on the object. And if you're scratching your heads right now, you know, it's okay. Know that this is just, you know, things like prototype JS, underscore JS, a lot of those, they're using an alternate technique where instead of using classes, they're creating objects and just patching extra functions onto them as needed. So IIFE, you will see the pattern very, very often. So underscore JS for creating and staying classes. Anything to do with creating and loading modules, what's called AMD, the asynchronous module definition, which I'm not going to go into here. It's way out of scope for a beginning class, but you'll see it. Or creating namespaces. Because you create a bunch of functions, well, those are all global vars. What happens if two functions collide? So a lot of developers instead will wrap all of their code in this IIFE to build a kind of a closed object, and then just assign that to one variable so you don't get a bunch of namespace collisions. It's how most libraries are written. The good news is that you really just have to recognize what it looks like, what that module pattern looks like. I'm actually going to leave that practice. You might choose to do it outside and come back because we have an hour and a half, and I want to make sure we've got some time for the less esoteric, more concrete, fun stuff. Let's play with some data. So start by putting some data in an object. Okay, I don't think anybody's confused by that one at this point. Right? It's an object, single property, called values. Turns out that what's called JSON, JavaScript object notation, is simply a JavaScript object turned into a string following a couple of simple rules. And this is a common way for passing data back and forth to servers. So the rule is it's a string. So I've got my wrappers on the outside here, my single quotes. All of the names, all the keys in the object have to be double quoted. All strings have to be double quoted. You can put strings, numbers, arrays, objects, true, false, null. That's it. Almost everything you can put in an object. You can't define a function in there. That would be really silly. And then if you're given a JSON string, the idea of a JSON string is it's really, you could actually just call in JavaScript what's called eval, which means here's a chunk of JavaScript, run it. Now eval is kind of dangerous. It's like blindfolding yourself and walking in somewhere and saying, hey, feed me anything. Right? Not the safest thing you could do. So there's actually, in new browsers, there's a thing called json.parse that'll take JSON data and parse it into an object. There is a script, and I give you a link for it in your notes, that if you're using an older browser, you download and run this script, loaded this script into your page, and it actually creates the JSON object with the parser on it. To go the other direction, call json.stringify and hand it a JS object, and it gives you back a JSON string. Very simple. So older browsers, there's the link to where to go get the script. You go to that GitHub site, you grab the file called json2.js and load it. So just for fun, since you have new browsers, let's try a little JSON. So I'll get you started with the first one. So actually, A is an array. Right? JSON.stringify the array A gives me back something that looks like an array. So go try it.
Is it supposed to return like undefined? That might actually be right.
JSON.parse or JSON.stringify?
Stringify.
Did you assign it to a variable?
Yeah, called data.
That's why you got the undefined, because var doesn't return anything.
Oh, okay.
So now just say data and hit return and then see what the browser says, what the console says.
Just return data?
No, just type data and hit return in the console to print it out. Is the whole purpose of doing that immediately invoked function expression to hide a variable? No, it's really to, it's a chance to run code to construct an object, whether it needs to be, whether you need to do some calculations to define the data, whether you need to generate a function, use a function closure. It's just basically says run some code to construct an object.
So why do you have to put it in a function then? Why can't you just put the code not in a function? And what does putting it in a function do that if you didn't do that, it wouldn't?
Sometimes you create, well, the reason you do it in function is sometimes you create the object and then patch things onto the object afterwards. Very commonly.
So a couple slides back, you had it where you did a return, and then you had one of these IIFEs in the return statement. So I didn't understand why you don't just say return and have the body of the function in that statement.
That, we'll go back to that one. We need to look at it actually to show you why.
Okay, let's see if this works.
Okay, let me see how folks are doing. This one's pretty straightforward.
Already done a lot of JSON.
Oh, I figured you'd be all over it. Going all right?
I think I'm not totally.
Okay. Trial and error. It's the only way you're really going to pick it up. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute, because I don't have to say.
Okay. Trust you for it.
Yeah, so I just do it. I say, here's my array of numbers.
Sure.
I can do it. The object.
So you can do JSON.stringify points, and it'll give you back a string.
The object is an array of those.
Sorry? Yeah, an array could be, or object can just be, curly bracket, name, colon, some value. Okay. So the second, you saw the first stage. Let's do the second one. Var colors, say equals right, pretty straightforward, and I could go the other way, create a string, parse it. Now, okay, now we get to play a bit. Graphs and charts. So, again, not straight JavaScript, but a really great use for it. And d3js.org, it's a library called Data-Driven Documents. It's completely open source, and it's fantastic. Mike Bostock, who wrote this, wrote originally a visualization library called ProtoViz, which is like the gold standard for data visualizations. And he now works for the New York Times doing all of their fancy data-driven graphics. So D3, what we're going to do is do a little bit of simple graphing and charting with it. I mean, we could have done more DOM manipulation, but it's not super interesting. And the nice thing about this is it gives you a little more of a chance to play with functions and doing stuff with functions. So here's the first thing. Let's show you a very simple D3 tutorial. And this comes straight out of the D3 documentation. All I did was I stripped back the headers on the page. So what this is going to do is it's going to call D3 select body, which is just like query selector or $ in jQuery. It takes a CSS reference and finds that thing. So D3 selects the body of the page and gives you back an object that refers to the body. Just like jQuery, there are methods on there for manipulating that object. So in this case, we're going to say body.append an h1. And just like jQuery, it's going to construct an h1 and give you back a reference to that. And then I could say h1.html and set the contents of that h1. After you've done after doing query selector all with inner HTML, and then after doing jQuery, this part should look really pretty familiar. It's just a slight variation on the syntax. So let's go ahead and open this page. And there it is, my hello world done entirely in code. Okay. So now, let me pop this window off so that it's separate. One of the fun things, and this is true also of jQuery, is let's say that I have a body with 2 sections in it. These could be divs, these could be sections, these could be anything, but I've got 2. So now I'm going to say D3 select all, just like query selector all, just like in jQuery, looking something up. And now I'm going to call append, but now this is on a multiple selection. What do you think this append is going to do? Wild guess. Put it in both of them? Any other guesses?
It's going to create a header for every single page, but you put something different on it?
Create a header for each of those, but put something different? Okay.
Good guess.
Let's try it. So it created a new H1 for each of those sections and injected it. But you know, D3 is about data-driven graphics. Why are we doing DOM manipulations? Well, because it can, and because one of the best things in the DOM is this thing called SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. If you can manipulate the DOM, you can manipulate SVG, and you can create some really nice graphics, including interactivity. So just another slight change here. Sections append H1, set the style color to red. That should look kind of familiar. We're doing method chaining, which you learned from jQuery. We're setting the color on each of these sections to be red. So I'll save it and reload it. Again, baby steps, but it's leading up to something interesting. Let's do an SVG graph. I was originally thinking about doing graphics with Canvas. The problem is, as an example, the problem is Canvas is really fantastic. It's this bitmap drawing environment, so you can do any drawing you like. But graphics programming is actually enough of a specialty unto itself that I didn't really want to confuse you horribly with it. SVG being, it's XML inside the DOM. It's a graphics format defined using XML. Is close enough to DOM programming that it's not going to break your brain. So here's what we're going to do. I've declared a bunch of points. So 0, the value 100. At 25, the value 50. At 50, the value 0. And at 75, 50. So there's just XY points. I'm going to find the SVG object in the page, which I've defined here as width 100, height 100. I'm going to say I want a line. I'm going to say pass the points into that line, and this will give me back a string called a path in SVG. It's the description of how to draw on the screen. And then I'm going to append that path to the SVG object, just like I would append an H1 or a paragraph to some HTML. And I'm going to set a class on it, and I'm going to set this attribute called D. This is the actual drawing instructions. Don't have to memorize this. A lot of this is pretty boilerplate. But let me run this code. And you'll see I've got this little graph up here that does an up-down peak. And actually, let me go run this code in Chrome so I can give you a bigger console to look at. If I look at the elements in the page, oops, I've got to make that a little smaller. You'll actually see that inside the SVG object is a path of class line where the D attribute is set to these instructions. And actually, if you remember, move 0, 100, line to 25, 50, line to 50, 0, line to 75, 50. There's the drawing instructions we just defined. So there's one more thing to know about D3. If I make a little change to my script here, I declare the points. I tell D3 to find the SVG object. I say to D3, I'm going to draw a line. When I say like D3 SVG.line, I can say also things like D3 SVG bar chart, or I could ask for a lot of different things it can do. This is the engine that's actually creating the drawing right here. I just picked a line for this case. And then I'll say SVG append a path, which we did before. Now I'm going to say, though, .datum points. So I'm going to say, when you append it, use this data. Declare the line, the attribute, the class of this is a line. Set attribute D to line. And what will happen is that this line, that SVG, when it sees a datum here and a function here, will say, I will call this function with each point in that line. So I don't have to go through an extra step of saying, get the line renderer, pull the function out of it, pass it the data. I can set it up like this. I know, it looks a little weird. Just, you can't think of this as the boilerplate, how you do it. And if I run this, I get the same result as before. The only reason I put that slide in there is because I spent a whole ton of time trying to debug it until I realized, no, wait, I have to do datum. But here's the other funny. Here's where D3 gets really nice. So far, we've basically said, OK, our graph is 100 wide and 100 tall, and we specified everything in pixel coordinates. But in D3, I can declare a series of just points along the line. 0, a half, 1, a half, 0. I can say the x scale is linear, or you can do log or exponential, any of those scaling functions for graphing. I can say the domain, the number of input, the number of values coming in is between 0 and however many points there are, points minus dot length minus 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the domain of this is really, it's really scale over 0 to 4. So over the range of 0 to 4, map that onto the numbers 0 to 100. So it's going to show on the bottom axis 0, 25, 50, 75, 100. And then I set up a linear scale for y. In this case, the range is between 100 and 0 is what it maps to. It assumes the input range of 0 to 1 and an output range of 100 to 0 in this case. So it also flipped it for me. And then I just say line, D3 SVG line. For x point, I pass in a function. So remember how you did like a for each where you got a, or a map where you got a function that was given each data point? This function is given each data point in the index, and it says, okay, I'm going to say use the x scale and pass the index number in this case. Because I've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 being passed in as indices. So this is going to take 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and map it onto the range of 0 to 100. So that'll stretch the x-axis. For the y point, I'll pass in a little custom function that says call the y function and pass in the data. And so that'll map 0 to 1 onto 0 to 100 and actually flip it upside down for me. And then just say SVG append path, pass it the data. Here's the class. D, which is the drawing instructions, say, okay, now finally call the line for me. So D3 has taken JavaScript and its functional programming nature and basically written a little language for building really sophisticated graphics. So let me rerun this. And oops, I've got a breakpoint. Let me just run that. And it does the same thing, because that's how I wrote it. Yeah, give it a try. Take one of the examples, and if you grabbed the repository, you'll have all of these D3 examples. Grab one, have D3 actually, instead of having the SVG element be part of the HTML page, have D3 create the SVG element and stick it into the page for you, just like you saw the example where I put an H1 in the body. And then set the height and the width of that element. You can, after you add it, you can say dot height, open parenthesis, and give it a height, dot width, open parenthesis, give it a width. So set that width, and just so play with that. And then for fun, if you're feeling brave, see about graphing a set of circles instead of a line. So we'll take, probably about 10 minutes for this. Now, one last thing, just start thinking about, we're getting towards the end of this. We've done a lot of JavaScript internals, we've done some practical stuff, we've done some examples. Think about when you were going home, when you're going home tonight, if you were going to work on something in JavaScript tomorrow, what would that be? And is there anything that would help you get that project started? Because we've left some time for discussion at the end of this. So think about what you might do tomorrow to build with this, and is there anything that you need help with to get there?
I have a question about SVGs, but it's probably pretty stupid.
Go for an SVG question.
Well, I had some graphics, and I wanted to make them SVGs because SVGs are good. So I converted them to SVGs and everything, and then Somebody told me that they can't have color, but I don't think that's true.
SVG can have color.
That's what I thought. I don't know why that person said that to me.
No, it's a very flexible, very powerful format. It's two-dimensional, which is the only, some people think that's a drawback.
Can I show you something?
Sure, why don't you go and work on this lab a bit.
Okay.
My microphone was off. There's going to be a tad bit of silence there. So I could say if not array.prototype.pop, meaning there's no pop function declared on the array, I could declare it myself. Array.prototype. Actually, let's do push. It's easier. I could do something like that. If array.prototype.push is not defined, that's what the exclamation point is for, is not. Array.prototype.push gets a new function. This sub this dot length, if the array is empty, that'll be 0. If the array has one element, that'll be 1. But remember, since array indices start at 0, that number will always be 1 past the end equal to x. So that would be a push. That would be extending the array. This is good and bad. One of the things that people will do is do something called for in, which we didn't actually touch on. You saw the regular numbered for loop. For in, so for x in y, will go through and give you each of the properties of y, including the properties of all of it, everything up the prototype chain. The problem is if you've gone and monkey patched an object and somebody's iterating over that object expecting a certain set of properties, they're now going to get an extra property they didn't know about and they didn't put there. It probably isn't what they expected. So what you should do if you're ever going to iterate over something like that, let me just do it on the screen here. Is what you really should do is you should say if x has own property, meaning it's not something that's coming in from the prototype, it's not been patched in, then you can do that and do something with it. So my Flash programming friend in the back of the room, that should look pretty familiar, actually, that approach. So has own property is a safety thing. If you ever iterate over all the properties of an object, use has own property to defend against somebody having patched things on. Otherwise, JavaScript being a dynamic language, there's actually no argument against basically monkey patching, adding stuff in. We also didn't talk about the next version of JavaScript. The next version of JavaScript is pretty far along. It's ES6, otherwise known as Harmony, and it adds some really interesting things for multi-threading. It adds what are called coroutines, where you can have stuff running in a couple of different threads and actually handing off back and forth to each other at different points in their execution. It adds a bunch of stuff, but it's way beyond the scope of this session. But what do you know now, right? Think about what you've picked up in just the last few hours. Variables, and when they turn into globals or not, how to keep them from turning into globals using useStrict. You've done a lot with functions. You've been able to write your own functions, pass them into things, store them in variables, pass them around. Control structures. So if, the do while loop, the for loop. Data types. Objects and arrays. So working with objects, knowing what happens to this, Working with classes, seeing how prototype works and how to make your own. You've built interactions, both with and without jQuery. You've played a little bit with visualizations in D3 and seen how to test your code across multiple browsers. So it's actually been quite a bit for this time. This is how much I had put together. With a class like this, the timing can be really variable. So yes, we're running up a little short, and that's fine. What projects, what do you want to do with JavaScript tomorrow? What are you going to do to kind of seal this knowledge in? And is there anything that's unclear that could use a little more explanation, example, or going back over to help you get there? In the back.
Earlier on when we were talking, the issue when someone used a browser with JavaScript disabled, techniques you could use. Is that something you want to cover offline?
So using a browser with JavaScript disabled, you had it. Part of that's a separate question. You had people that you were doing client-side checking with JavaScript on a form submit, and you were getting bad form data. The short answer is you always have to validate on the server. The client-side checking is only for the convenience of the user. They don't type something stupid. You always have to revalidate on the server side. Now, Now, what you can do using something like Modernizer is Modernizer will put a class of Node.js, a CSS class, on your page. When Modernizer runs, requires JavaScript, it will remove that and replace it with a class of JS. So you could actually make the JavaScript-dependent parts of your page. You got some CSS that says these parts are only visible if JS is available. So you could actually hide that stuff. But in terms of your security question, you've got to validate on the server. Who else?
How about like security issues with fixing all HTTP requests, making calls?
I'm sorry, you'll have to speak up just a little bit. I apologize.
How about security issues dealing with connections, other websites, and so forth?
So security issues, there's a couple of security issues. I mean, one of the big problems with JavaScript is it's basically transmitted as plain source. So people can go in and inspect it. You don't know exactly where your scripts are coming from. Although you could have your scripts served up over HTTPS, which will help. You can always on a script, in another script, you can go look at a script and look at its origin, which is where it came from, to verify that somebody didn't bring it in from another place. In terms of transferring data back and forth, there's a format called JSON-P that gets used a lot, which is you go to the other server and say, give me some data. And it returns the data actually as an executable script, a function that you run. So that's where you use something like the JSON parse to actually parse the data as opposed to simply executing the function. But better yet is to use data transport mechanisms that don't use a script as the intermediary, which is actually one of the reasons WebSocket was invented, was because most people have to ask the server to give them a script to pass the data back. It has to do with a thing called the single origin rule, which we could discuss separately because it's a whole complicated thing. And WebSocket was designed from the beginning to not be locked into the single origin rule. It actually works with something called cross-origin resource sharing. So what else? I mean, think about a project that you might do tomorrow, not a big fancy one. What else would help you get that project done?
We're doing a little bit of cores. Can you describe what that is? I think it's similar to JSON-P, but I'm not sure.
Okay, let me hold off on cores for a minute and just check the rest of the room for JSON or for JavaScript. If there's no more JavaScript questions, we'll close and I'll walk you and anybody else who's interested through single origin model, cores, networking, because I can do that stuff cold.
When you were talking about test runner and test swarm for testing.
Right, JS test driver and the test swarm, yeah.
Do we need to do that across different, testing the different browsers across different OSs, like on Mac OS and
Oh, is it a good idea to run? So if you have a swarm of browsers running your test, are they all in the same OS or should they be on different OSs? In an ideal world, you would have some Windows machines and some Linux machines and some Macs, and they'd all be looking at a core test server, and they'd all be communicating with it across your internal network, because if those are the browsers your customers are using, you really should check against them. There are certain OS/browser, combinatorial bugs that you got to watch for. So that's, of course, you want to test that way. Other questions? Okay, one other thing. I'll give you an easy question. What was something that caught your interest today? What was something you found interesting? The graphics? Like the D3 stuff?
I went to the website, the D3 one,
Yeah?
and I looked at some of the examples. Really impressive.
The D3 examples are impressive, and there's a huge library of examples there where you just grab the code and run it. And then modify it. Yeah? It's fantastic stuff.
I guess I never understood JSON really until today.
You just got JSON. Excellent.
You clicked. It's working with data. That's why they're always talking about it like that.
So now you understand what JSON is and why. How about over here? What was something that caught your attention?
This immediately.
The IIFE?
Yeah, that was, I never understood
It's
that.
We'll unpack it a little more later. I think you more or less just need to sleep on it and look at it again. How about here? Anyone? Closures? They got your attention and hopefully some understanding?
Possibly already doing it, who didn't know it.
Excellent. Yeah, seriously, you are doing them and don't know it. That's the interesting part. How about here?
Opened my eyes to a lot of new things to research. I didn't know a lot about the new things in JavaScript. Been stuck on the old paradigm a bit.
Yep. So learning how to modernize your JavaScript, basically.
Yeah.
Excellent. How about here? JSONP. Okay. Let me quickly explain JSONP, by the way. So there's a rule, because the question's come up now several times. There's a rule in the browser that says where you get your page from is the only thing you can talk to for data. So if I get my page from apple.com, the rule in the browser, it's called the single origin rule, says you can only talk to you can only make what's called an AJAX call, a data call to apple.com to get your data. You can't say, get the page from Apple and have the page from Apple go talk to Google and get the data. And the browser is actually what enforces that. It sees what's called a cross-origin request and just blocks it. So, but there are some exemptions to the cross-origin rule. So a page from website X is allowed to get an image from anywhere. It's allowed to get a script from anywhere. So JSONP simply says, well, okay, you're not going to let me make my data request, Mr. Fancy Pants browser. I'm going to pretend I'm making a script request off to this side thing. And so it makes a script request off to that server, and that server actually wraps it up in a script, in the correct tags, wraps it up in a function, so wraps all the data up and hands you back a script that you then execute. So you're lying to the browser. You're saying, I'm not getting data. No, I'm just getting another script. And so that's what JSONP is. It's JSON wrapped in a procedure, in this case a function, that you then execute. The problem is you're now getting a function that you're running, and of course you've opened up the hole of, if you've got an attacker in the middle, they could tamper with that. They could inject code into your browser to be executed. It's also just a ton of overhead. Every time you do an HTTP request, it's typically a 1K to 2K bytes overhead. So you might be getting 100 bytes of data, but you're spending another 1,000 to get it. It's horribly inefficient. And so WebSocket was built by folks who were researching actually bidirectional data communications and realized that it just didn't work well. And they said, we really could use a new protocol. And that's where they came up with this idea of you just open a connection and you just push what data you need back and forth either way. And it's very high efficiency. But that's what JSONP is. How about here? Testing tools, good, yeah.
You verify the code runs and all works fine. And how about the graphics too? About the data and manage.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I like the JS test runner that you didn't have to include your body or head tags.
The JS test runner and some of the HTML5, minimalist page tricks. Bunch of little stuff. Okay, cool. I'll let you guys in on a secret. I'm asking this question not for ego stroking. The reason I'm asking you what caught your interest, A, it's going to help you remember it tomorrow. B, look, I know what it's like. Teacher says, do you have any questions? And your brain just kind of freezes. But you can find at least one thing you like here. And often in the process of thinking about, okay, I'm going to review this. Oh, what did I like out of this class? The questions will surface. How about you? Anything interesting caught your attention?
It was really cool. We work a lot with data visualization, so sort of being able to see what's out there.
Yeah, so I gave you a tiny intro to D3, but yeah, it's worth exploring in depth.
And I have a better handle on the 10th and other than.
Excellent. How about you?
I found this operations that you went over really interesting.
Understanding how this switches around and how to bind it in. Good. How about in the back?
I like the graphics stuff. I do a lot of UI work, so I'm always trying to find a way to do skill on the graphics.
Oh, nice. Yeah, UI work in SVG. People are doing that too. Look at a project called Blossom.js. It is a programming framework that uses, actually they use Canvas, but they build the entire UI that way. So for it might actually be a nice prototyping kind of environment for you. And there's a builder app for it. So you could do drag and drop and set things up and do some fast prototyping. It might be useful.
I will be testing and then modernizer.
Modernizer and, okay.
The best part about testing was like how you can test multi-browser.
The multi-browser tests, yep.
The kind of work we do, we always get bugs in like one browser or one platform, so it's pretty cool that you can test something in the browsers. And
There's one thing I forgot to show you. Thank you, I just remembered. There is another browser testing tool called Selenium at selenium.org. Selenium is not a JavaScript test tool. It's an engine that takes a script, and the script, by the way, is written in HTML, and it says, click here, find this element, click on it, enter this value, wait 2 seconds, look at this area of the screen. So it's instructions like you would give to a human, except it's an automated test runner for your browsers. And you can build it up so that you can run this same Selenium script across a huge range of browsers. So if you're getting, you might actually use that for like fast automated testing, integration testing, to say, okay, is this browser behaving? And basically confirm that it's working correctly. There's also a nice little development environment, programming environment for it that runs in Firefox that actually records your actions and writes the script for you, and then you can modify the script. So Selenium is fantastic, and it's completely free. It's completely open source and has been for a long time. So that also might help you out, and you too. How about up here? Actually, I'll start in the front.
Me?
Who, me? Anything interesting? What kind of caught your attention in the class?
For this.
I'll give you a minute to think about it. Here?
graphics and charts.
The graphics and charting. You also might look at a library called rgraph. It's for Canvas. It's basic. It does a nice set of graphs and charts, and it's actually going to be easier to use than D3. D3 is a lot more powerful and flexible. rgraph is kind of a basic charting library, but it's open source and free and quite nice. rgraph. How about here?
I guess the part where we're talking about functions kind of inside of functions.
Yeah, nesting functions, yeah.
Within a function.
It's a very common way of writing things.
So I've seen it, and then I've kind of gotten a little confused.
You saw it, kind of went, what's going on here? So now you know.
I know what's going on, but not sure, so it's good to see it and kind of get walk through it.
Yes.
So I've done basic things with jQuery in the past, and so after going through this, I have a feeling that I may challenge myself to do those same tasks with just JavaScript, so that I don't have to load the entire library.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to go. Yeah, you've done stuff with jQuery and looking for ways to do it kind of with the standard DOM programming. Look at a site called Vanilla.js. It is not a library. It sort of looks like it is a library, but it isn't. It's a compendium of techniques for doing a lot of the jQuery-ish things in straight JavaScript without needing jQuery.
I like all the different ways that you can write the functions.
Uh-huh.
There's the intuitive way that your brain kind of thinks out and should go here, here, here. And then there's the much cleaner, simpler way that just makes your code look a lot nicer.
Yep. Oh, reminds me. Thank you. Talking about ways to write functions. See, that's the other reason we're doing this, is because there's so many little things in JavaScript that I want to tell you two more interesting bits. Now, these regular programmers will know these already. There are a couple of really interesting operators in JavaScript. If I say, actually, the first interesting operator is the comma operator. Var z equals 0, a equals 4 with a comma in between. I'm actually doing two separate things in this statement executed in this order. So I'm creating variable z, variable a, and I'm initializing them both. That's one. Here's the interesting bit. So I can say x, I'll make it a var, equals a double pipe sign, double or sign, z. And what this does is this looks at the value of a, and if a is true, meaning it's non-zero, that value is returned to x. If I said x equals z or a, it'll evaluate this first. If it's 0, then it says, OK, well, let me go ahead and evaluate the second thing. Now, these don't have to be variables. These might be function calls. So this is a trick for saying, try this, and if this comes back false, try that. This is a shorthand way of saying, if z, x equals z, else x equals a. But it's a shorter way of doing it. The other way you can do it is, well, actually, let me explain. So there's a really nice use for this that you're going to see in a lot of functions. Let's say I've got a function with some kind of optional value that I'm going to pass in. You will often see var x equals, sorry, I lied, opt equals opt, double pipe or, and some value. What does this mean? Evaluate opt if it's falsy. So let's say somebody did not pass the optional value in. That's going to be undefined. Undefined is falsy. So it says opt equals opt. Well, if opt is defined, it's immediately returned. If opt is not defined, it goes on to the second stage and actually defines it. Super common idiom you'll see in JavaScript. I probably should go patch it back into the course. One of the things about this being GitHub, I'm going to wind up going back and adding some stuff. So that's a really common idiom. The other one you don't see quite as much is that's double or. So the other one you'll see is double and again, my ampersands are terrible. Double and says If x is false, return false immediately. If x is true, then return whatever the value of y is. So this says, if this is true, do the second thing. The fancy name for it, for the Java programmers, such a thing is short circuit evaluation. Right? Do only the minimum amount of work. So, but that idiom at the top is very, very common. So, thank you. You indirectly reminded me of it. Anything else that caught your attention? Yeah.
No, I've kind of covered the things I...
You're covered. Yeah, because we talked about the node script and all that. And we've talked about, kind of the data graphics. Anything else?
My next question is what further information?
Further information. So the last slide of here points to some books and such. There are classes that are taught. We've been doing stuff through the San Francisco HTML5 user group. We're doing it a couple of times a year, teaching actually it's a beginner's CSS and HTML course if you're curious about that. But we're also totally interested in running other courses through the user group, and those are shorter, pretty focused, but they also tend to be low cost because they're being run for the community. I also don't want to take away from the fantastic work that's being done here, because stuff gets run here. You can always talk to the organizer and say, hey, I'd like to see a course in this, something else. But I'll point you at the books that are available. Go ahead.
Any frameworks you recommend looking into?
Oh, frameworks, can of worms. AngularJS is very popular, but man, it's huge and heavy. A lot of people are using Backbone. And I think with what you know now, you could wrap your head around it. That's probably where I would start, is something like Backbone, something lightweight and straightforward. But if you need lots of data binding, look at Angular, look at Knockout. It really depends on your needs. How about towards the back?
Test tools?
Test tools, like, QUnit. One I mentioned on the slide but didn't talk about much is if you do the business-driven development, Jasmine, super, super popular and also free. How about back there? Okay, excellent.
Still the scoping you talked about earlier, the nested calls.
The scoping, the nested, okay, excellent.
Thought you could into this discussion of frameworks and stuff. For the last few months I've been developing some smartphone apps.
Yep.
And I started with the long story, the painful story. Went through jQuery mobile, done that.
Yep.
Went to the framework tool from Intel, which is actually a lot more efficient for a smartphone.
Yep.
Any recommendations?
Recommendations for frameworks for doing mobile apps in HTML5.
Yeah, not games. It's not games, not graphics intensive.
Not games, not graphics intensive. Give me a second. Honestly, I wouldn't use any specialized framework for that. I would still consider something like, for single-page applications in that, I would still consider something like Backbone. The biggest thing you got to watch for in doing the mobile apps is you really need to get everything tight and small because the cache sizes on mobile devices are extremely small. And you don't want your stuff getting kicked out of the cache. You can, on most of those devices, use what's called the application cache, the offline cache. But the problem with application cache is it's a real challenge then to update the app contents that are being sent out to people. So I would look at something like Backbone, one of the smaller, lighter weight frameworks.
Or don't use a framework, right?
Or don't use a framework. Yeah, that's always the trade-off.
Yeah. Either or just go to native if you're.
Or go native. Yeah, I teach a whole class on this stuff. So yeah, and I'm actually a really experienced native developer on iOS. So.
There's just some stuff that Java's not quite ready for yet, right?
JavaScript actually, surprisingly, these days it's become an amazing little language. And it's very, very fast. The new compilers, basically the browsers are doing really interesting things with watching how your code runs, figuring out where the spots are, where it's happening, or like functions are getting called a lot, or figuring out where it needs to speed up, and selectively compiling those to native machine code. And it used to be they'd go through a couple of layers of this. There'd be the interpreter, and then the compiler. And then WebKit went to a 3-stage. The first compile, the second, which is a data flow compiler, which optimized some stuff away, and then go to machine code. Now they've actually got the new versions of WebKit, which have not yet shipped in production, which are the nightly builds, actually have gone to a 4-stage, really seriously optimizing compiler on the 4th level.
Related to that, minimizing JavaScript. Like on jQuery, you get jQuery.min.
Right. Okay. So minifying stuff. 2 things. Maybe 3. So minification by itself just means removing comments and white space. And that's the safest thing you can do. It generally does not alter the behavior of your program. A lot of the compressors, though, then go, like compressors like Uglify or the Closure compiler, go further. They take and do things like variable names inside your functions, they rename them to make them shorter. They might rearrange your code. They might find parts of your code that are never called and strip them out. So they actually reorganize your code and tighten it up. There's a danger there that sometimes that will break code, like in WordPress, if anybody does WordPress stuff. If you use a slider, those sort of screen carousels, the slider JavaScript actually depends on certain variable names being set because it's actually passing data to and from PHP that way. And so if you uglify those, if you actually compress that code, you break the slider. I mean, a straight minify is always safe because all you're doing is removing white space and comments. It's when you start getting into things like uglify that rewrite the code in a different structure, then you're potentially at risk. The answer, as always, is test before and test after. What can you do?
Can you make all the JavaScript on the Google search page readable?
Yeah, there are. That's really been chopped down with the Closure compiler. Oh, I lost the name of it. There is actually code out there that will take and make reasonable guesses at variable names and all that, and actually re-inflate it up into a fairly readable form. Okay, well, I think, given that, resources for your journey. So one of the things I like, it's a beginner's book, but there's a lot of good depth in it. It's called Eloquent JavaScript, and it's linked from here, eloquentjavascript.net. Daily.js is a website and a blog of basically what's going on in the JavaScript world, new libraries, interesting things going on. At this point, you probably could follow it and actually get a lot of interesting stuff out. JavaScript. This is Angus Kroll's blog, JavaScript weblog, .wordpress.com. He doesn't publish very often, but what he does is really interesting details of the language. The Yahoo user interface group, their YUI library blog actually publishes really interesting things going on in the JavaScript world daily. The JavaScript Garden, which I forgot to link to, but I will. If you just do a search on that, it's a page at GitHub that's published that will take you from what you know now. Actually, you know about 2/3 of it already. We covered it. It's kind of intermediate to high intermediate, low advanced JavaScript techniques. Go back and review it in a couple of days. It'll actually seal in a lot of what you got here today. And then jslint.com, play around with jslint, jshint, see how it remarks on your code. And with that, go this way. Thank you. So, my contact information was supposed to be here and is missing. I will add it back in. Alternately, I do have my business cards with me. You are more than welcome to a card. I'm really happy to get emails from folks. I love it when I get them from people who are in class because it tells me you're doing something with this. Okay. So thank you very much. I'll stick around till 4 with other questions.